Is it possible, maybe, just maybe, that empathy might be sinful? Stay tuned, and we'll talk about it. Well, good evening, and welcome back to another week of Explained, another week where we engage the culture from a biblical perspective in a manner which glorifies God. My name is Troy. I am your host. And once again, I want to thank you guys for taking some time out of your Thursday night to join us. We very much appreciate it here. Whether you tune in to my show here on Thursday nights, or whether you tune in to Steve's show, Plain Truth, on Tuesday nights, please know that we appreciate each and every one of you, and we want to put out stuff that will be helpful to you, beneficial to you, and that will build you up spiritually. So with that in mind, today we are going to talk about empathy, and whether or not it could be categorized as sinful, as a sin. And you might be asking yourself, why are we here talking about empathy? Like, what is the purpose of talking about this? What led up to this? Well, let me tell you. Way back, and this was years ago, Doug Wilson and Joe Rigney had this podcast episode, I think it was, where they talked about, they called it the sin of empathy. And that made a lot of people mad. That made a lot of people very, very angry that they would even broach the subject, that potentially there could be a way in which empathy is sinful. Because we always think of empathy as a very positive thing, right? You know, empathy is constantly put forward to people in the church as a positive character trait. And you know, what could be wrong about empathy? How could empathy possibly be sinful, right? So people talking about that a lot, you know, constantly being angry at Doug Wilson and Joe Rigney for that. You know, then that's kind of been going on for a couple of years. You know, people just kind of bring it up periodically. But then the hornet's nest got kicked because Allie Beth Stuckey put out a book very recently called Toxic Empathy, and that really just got everybody up into a flurry. Again, the idea that empathy could be maybe toxic, that people just could not tolerate that. And so they came after her for that. And even more recently, there has been an announcement that Joe Rigney is putting out this book, The Sin of Empathy. And of course, cue the firestorm once again. Everybody getting all up in a frenzy about that. And the most recent thing, this was in my opinion, at least for the reason why we're talking about this today, the last log on the fire for me, the last straw that broke the camel's back that made me say, all right, we got to talk about this, was just this week, Joe Rigney went on Al Mohler's podcast and talked about, just kind of explained his position on empathy and what that did, because Rigney, though he's overlapped with Mohler in some areas in the past, Rigney is a pastor. I believe he's a pastor now at a CREC church, which is a Presbyterian church up in Idaho. And Al Mohler is leading a Baptist seminary. And so really at this current point in time, there's not a ton of overlap, and there's the potential, and I think this is what I was seeing happen, was because Mohler had Rigney on his podcast, his ideas, I think, were put out to a group of people in Mohler's audience that maybe potentially hadn't been aware of this idea, the possibility, the notion that there could be a side of empathy that is sinful. And so that kicked up another firestorm. You know, people upset at Mohler for platforming Rigney with these ideas. People obviously upset at Joe Rigney. And so with all of that background, I have some thoughts myself about empathy. And you know, a lot of this that I decided I wanted to say about empathy has been kind of, you know, cooking on the back burner for a little while. And so I want to talk about it. So let's talk about empathy. And the first thing that I will say just right out of the gate, I'm not going to leave you in suspense. The question was, is it possible that empathy could be sinful? The answer is yes. Yes, it is very much possible that empathy can be sinful. And it depends on the circumstance. It depends on I guess the question that I would have coming back at you. If you ask me, is empathy a sin? My response to you is, what do you mean by empathy? Because people will take the word empathy and they'll use it. We've talked about this with many other words. They'll use it in a lot of different ways. They'll use it to justify a lot of different things. And one person's idea of empathy, it probably looks completely different from this other person over here's idea of empathy. And empathy has become a justification for doing a lot of things that are objectively wrong. And so that's why I would ask that response to, whoever asked me the question in the first place, right? If you ask me, is empathy a sin? I would say, what do you mean by empathy? Because depending on your answer to that, the answer is either yes or no. And so I would say, yes, it is possible that empathy is sinful, depending on the circumstance, depending on the type of empathy that we're talking about here, okay? One thing that's interesting, just to kind of maybe help you process this, and I think I've heard Joe Rigney say this several times, over the years. This is not just. I did hear him. I heard him say it on the Moeller podcast, but I've heard him say it several times over the years. Is that we don't have, basically what he said was, we don't have this problem with other types of emotions, of feelings that people have, right? So you talk about, I think the example he usually gives is anger. Okay, so you talk about anger. No one has a problem with thinking, okay, yes, there are forms of anger that are okay, that are permissible. There are forms of anger that are sinful. No one has that problem with that. No one has issues parsing that out. But for some reason, when we come to empathy, people have that problem. They can't parse out that there are some situations, you could say, manifestations, I guess, of empathy that are good. There are some that are not good. Okay, and so as we think about why empathy can be considered sinful, I want to look at a couple of different examples. And what I want you to do as we start here is think about all of the craziness that you've seen in our culture over the past, let's even cut a really short lens. Let's not go back too far. Let's say over the past 5 years, okay? Think of all the craziness that you've seen in the culture. Now, depending on what we mean when we say empathy, many of the things that happened in the culture over the past 5 years could have been justified by the people that were doing them by saying, oh, I'm just being empathetic. I'm just having empathy for these people. Okay, let me give you a couple of examples. In 2020, there were riots all over the place. They were burning down cities. They were killing people. And this was done in the name of empathy. Okay, because there is a type of empathy that flies off the handle, that is not held in check by the rest of what the Bible says, that becomes overly emotional and that checks the reasoning faculties of your brain at the door before you go in to do the crazy thing that your empathy is causing you to do. Okay, so when we think about empathy, that's the idea of entering into someone's situation. Okay, like you are entering into that person's trouble, that person's problem, as if you are that person. Okay, but there is a way to do that where you lose all reasoning abilities, right? Where you start to actually think like the person that's going through the thing that you're trying to empathize with them over. And the problem is, if you think like that person enough, you get emotional about the situation and you start to lose your ability to reason through a situation through the lens of the Bible. Okay, and so the 2020 situation where the people hit the streets and they started burning down buildings and looting things, that could have been justified by this idea of empathy. Another example of this empathy where it just completely goes out of check with everything else. It becomes out of balance with all the other things that you're called to do as a Christian, and then therefore becomes sinful, would be potentially a situation where someone wants to have a surgery that is a gender change surgery, you could say. And we've seen this several times. This has been one of the most talked about things in our culture over the past 5 years, is the idea of people, changing from trying, supposedly changing, right, from male to female, doing these transgender surgeries. And there are people who say, you know what, they should be able to do that. And the reason that they give is because, I'm just feeling the way that they feel. I'm trying to enter into their situation. And, if I was them, then what would I want? What would I want to do? Well, the problem is what happens in that process is you check your reasoning abilities at the door. Okay, you lose all ability to reason. And you lose the clear teaching of the scriptures. Okay, that God makes people male and female. He makes them that way. And so we have no right to change that. But when you have that kind of the empathy that goes out of control and that gets out of balance with everything else that you're called to be and do as a Christian, you start to lose that ability to reason. And so that's really the thing that I want to impress upon you. When your empathy and your emotions, as a result of that empathy, begin to inhibit your abilities to reason through a situation, that's how you know that you're passing into sinful territory with empathy. Okay? And just to be very clear about this, the Bible talks about how we are called as Christians to have a sound mind and to be reasonable. I'll just give you a couple of examples. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 6 through 7. For this reason I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God gave us a spirit, not of fear, but of power and love and self-control. Okay, and self-control has a lot to do with your mind and controlling yourself in that area. Okay, if you let your emotions drive you, then you've lost control. You don't have self-control if that's the case. Okay, so God has called us to be self-controlled. We're called to have a sound mind. That's another translation of that verse as well. You see that where it says self-control there. Some other translations of that verse would insert the word sound mind. And that's the idea. Either one. The idea is you're keeping your emotions in check, and you're causing your emotions to submit to the truth that you know. Okay, and empathy can become dangerous when it fuels those emotions and brings those emotions to a place where now they're driving the ship instead of the other way around, instead of reason, instead of the scriptures, the truth driving the ship. Another example would be in James chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. You talk about wisdom from above. How do I become a wise person in the eyes of God, which is really what matters? How do I become wise in that sense, in a heavenly sense? Well, James 3, verses 17 and 18 describes this kind of wisdom. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Look at that verse 17. The wisdom from above is what? Open to reason. Okay, and there becomes a point, if you allow your empathy for someone to fuel your emotions to the point where you're not thinking clearly, that you become closed to reason, and now you're not being wise in the eyes of heaven. You're not you're not showing that you have that wisdom from above. So as Christians, we are called to be open to reason, and we are called to have control of our feelings, to have control of ourselves, to have a sound mind. And the problem with empathy is that sometimes empathy dispatches reason. Okay, and really the clear teaching of the Bible is, as Christians, we need to be reasonable. And so if you allow empathy to burn in you to the point where you begin to lose control of your reasoning abilities and now your emotions are taking over, that's how you know you're crossing into territory where empathy can be sinful. Empathy breeds unreasonable thought processes. Okay, and that's the danger. That's the danger. Okay, so you might be saying at this point, wait a second, and I do want to handle this objection. Doesn't the Bible talk about empathy? Doesn't the Bible talk about empathy? Like I feel like I've heard people say that, and in a sense, I understand, because it's almost like that idea of empathy is so implanted into our minds in the West as Christians that we just kind of assume that the Bible talks about it in glowing terms all the time, every time, right? But that's just not the reality. That's not the reality. And one thing that I'll say just right out of the gate is that empathy is not a fruit of the Spirit. Empathy is not a fruit of the Spirit. And why is that important? Well, that's important because it puts empathy in a different category. You think about, for example, the fruit of the Spirit, right? Those things that are brought out by the Spirit of God working in you. Empathy is not a fruit of the Spirit. Empathy is in a different category. Empathy is more of a reaction, you could say. It's less of a character trait and more of something that wells up inside of you when you see something else happening. And that's really key, because if you think about the other things that could fall into that category, we talked about anger earlier. You could maybe say that happiness could fall into that category, right? You see something and makes you happy. Pleasure might fall into that category. And I would say empathy could fall into that category as well. It's a reaction to something that you're seeing. Whereas the fruit of the Spirit is not a reaction to something that you're seeing outside of you. The fruit of the Spirit is produced by the Holy Spirit inside of you. And the only thing it could even be a reaction to is the presence of God inside of you and the work of Christ on the cross. But these things, these reactions, you could say, these reactionary type of emotions and feelings that someone feels, they're triggered by the things that go on around you. And there is a point where you can have these things and they start to take control of you. And that's where it's wrong. Okay. So to handle that objection, does the Bible talk about empathy? Doesn't the Bible talk about empathy always in glowing terms? Well, the answer that I would have, first of all, is that the Bible talks about other things more in more glowing terms, like the fruit of the Spirit, for example, okay? But I do want to entertain this objection. Someone might point to Hebrews 13, verse 3. Remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. That's Hebrews 13:3. So notice that. Remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them. And you might say, man, I don't know, Troy, that sounds a lot like empathy. Okay? And I'm not denying that there are good forms of empathy, that there are good practices of empathy, that there are good applications of empathy. No one's denying that. And that was a mistake I made at first when I started to hear about this stuff. And this was probably years ago at this point. But I remember when I first started to hear about it, I asked the wrong question. I asked myself, is empathy a sin? Okay, and that's the wrong question to ask. The right question to ask is, can empathy be sinful? And there's a big difference between those two things, because to say that empathy is a sin, that would seem to indicate that across the board, that it's wrong. That it just full, broad-brushed, wide swath condemnation of all forms of empathy. And what I realized over time is no one's saying that. And the Bible's not saying that either. The argument that's being made is that there are situations where empathy can be sinful. Okay. And I want to look at an area where I've noticed that this can be a problem. It can be a danger. Okay, and that is in evangelism. Now, people a lot of times will talk about being able to empathize with the person who you're sharing the gospel with. Okay, now remember what we mean when we say empathy. We're not talking about sympathy. Okay, we're not talking about trying to feel bad for someone or trying to understand their situation. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about entering into their situation. Okay, now a lot of people have talked about empathy in that way. Here's the problem. Here's the problem with that. I think that empathy can be very, very dangerous in evangelism. Here's why. Because if you begin to enter into someone's situation as an unbeliever, yourself being a believer, and you're talking to an unbeliever, you begin to try to enter into their situation. They have a lot of unhealthy views of God. Okay, and that's true because they're not a Christian. Okay, anybody who's not a Christian has a lot of unhealthy views of God. And what begins to happen is you begin to adopt, maybe. You begin to start to think, maybe they have a point there, and that, you start to feel bad for them, and you almost start to feel a little bit like angry at God. Here's an example of that. I once heard, and I've actually heard, I think I've heard several instances where this is the case. I've mentioned Pastor Tim Conway on this channel before. I'm very thankful for his work. He has a ministry where people write in and they ask him questions and things like that, really difficult questions. And one of the questions that he'll get often is a question like, I'm trying to come to God, but I can't, or I'm trying to repent, but I can't. And a lot of times what these people will do when they write the letters is they'll because they have a flawed view of the situation. So they'll paint themselves as a very pious person, right? As trying really hard to do the right thing, as if they don't have any impure motive, not even in one fiber of their being. Okay, and one thing that Tim Conway has said is you have to be very careful when you're dealing with these situations, because the more that you enter into their situation and the more that you kind of engage their argument, and they're like, I'm coming to Christ, but he's not accepting me, and things like, they begin to say things that are completely unbiblical. And what happens is if you get too emotional in those situations, you begin to say, why isn't God accepting them? What's the problem here, right? You start to get maybe even upset at God. Okay, and that's dangerous. That's dangerous for you. And that's not going to help their situation either, because you're pointing them further away from the solution. Okay, what do we know about the Bible? Like if they say, I'm trying to come to Christ, but I can't, or I'm trying to clean up my life, but I can't. The reality is, if you did come to Christ, if you really came to Christ, he would accept you. Okay, the solution is not to stand there and blame God for the situation. And this can happen in so many other forms of evangelistic encounters as well. So be very careful using and employing empathy in evangelism, okay? And really, at the end of the day, when we talk about empathy, the question that we have to ask ourselves is not, is empathy a sin? It's, can empathy be sinful? And I think the response to that question has been completely overblown, people going nuts about it, people getting upset about it and frustrated about it. But the reality is there are situations where empathy can be sinful. And just acknowledge that and don't go crazy over it. Don't, blow your mind over it. Okay? Well, I hope this show was helpful, and I hope you guys have a great week, and I will see you next time. God bless.